big welcome to our gallery. Welcome. Councillors and officers who are joining us remotely are reminded to put their mobile phone or electronic device on silent if they have one near them. And those present in the room should face forward, speak directly into their microphones, and not place papers or electronic devices between themselves and the microphones. Please would remote participants mute their microphones when not speaking, as this will reduce feedback, background noise and save bandwidth to prevent loss of connection. Members of the Council joining us remotely should leave their cameras on. Members present in the room will speak first. Those members joining us remotely will then be invited to speak, and if they should indicate their wish to do so by using the raised hand facility. Only those members present in the room will be voting on any recommendations, and I will confirm the results verbally for the benefit of those watching the webcast. Are there any apologies for absence?
None, Chairman.
Graham Brown. Are there any disclosures by members of personal and disclosable pecuniary interests in matters on the agenda? If so, please declare the nature of any such interest and whether members regard the personal interest as prejudicial under the terms of the Code of Conduct. No, there are none. Members are reminded to reiterate interest at the time the matter is discussed. Number 3, to receive the report of the Licensing and General Purposes Committee on a matter for the determination by full council at its meeting held on the 31st of August 2022. Members will recall this item was deferred at our last meeting held on the 21st of September. Councillor Mear.
Chair, I move that the report of the Licensing and General Purposes Committee be so moved.
Thank you very much. Do we have a second? I second that. Thank you, Councillor Bayliss. We'll now go to discussion. Councillor Giawan.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to propose an amendment using the supplementary information that was circulated. So my proposal would be that we accept number 1 of the proposal, which is an increase in all scales for an amount of £1,500. With regards to the second point, I don't support the backdating to April 22, and I believe that we should keep the pay review period as September to September. So this pay award will be effect from last month, i.e. September. The other points that we're working through on the document was around the home working allowance. Now, I don't think we've had an opportunity as a council to discuss the benefits or the perhaps disadvantages of doing that. So I feel that we should refer that to an HR committee within the council that can consider whether or not that is the right thing to do, and if it is, how do we set up the criteria to ensure that that's fair for everybody involved. In regards to the broadband allowance, I would say the same thing. That is part of an allowance review, so that should be considered by an HR committee looking specifically at pay and allowances. And I would also then tag on the requirement or the ask for additional annual leave, that is reviewed altogether as a package of additional benefits to our staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Giawan. So I understand the discussion on the floor now is regarding the amendment. Second. We have a second, Councillor Bailey.
No, Councillor Bailey seconded the original.
Okay, so we need a second to the amendment, please. Any second to that? Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to second what Councillor Giawan has said, and I think everyone who's involved in this process, both in licensing and general purposes, full council and then second full council, will appreciate that this isn't actually the most professional way to be going about doing a staff pay rise. And I think we need the HR committee to come into force and to actually be the driving force behind what our policy is and how we go forward. One direct question, if I may, to an officers. Do we currently have a working at home policy?
As members will know, when COVID came in, we said to all officers, you work from home if you can, which the vast majority of my colleagues have been doing. We were holding off bringing people back into the office pending the potential changes to the town hall scheme. Obviously, that will need to be revisited as time goes forward. So we don't have a formal working at home policy as such. People are working at home, and we have guidance on what people do when they're working from home.
Councillor Dixon?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I suggest then that that's definitely one of the first things that the HR committee should do, come up with a proper working from home policy so that we can actually reward those people who work from home fairly. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Dixon. Anyone else want to? Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Chairman. I support what Councillor Giovanni has said, actually. And the other thing that sort of needs looking at, and as he said so, is the allowance for broadband and the allowance for working at home. We need to be careful how that is, needs looking at, because obviously the staff, if they're going to work from home and get this allowance, then there needs to be a sort of almost a mechanism that they get that allowance and then don't get taxed on it. You can see what I mean. I don't know if you can do that. Probably not, but it seems perverse that you work from home, so you can you get an allowance for broadband and additional heating, and then you get a bigger tax bill, which seems, obviously if they can't do that, then that's it. But I'm self-employed. I like to, if I can trim my tax bill, I can. I will. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne. I think it's quite very evident that HR could look into all sides of this. It obviously needs a lot more discussion. Councillor Cortell.
May I ask a question at this stage? Would it be possible, or would the proposer consider putting a deadline on the HR committee coming up with their solution? Because at the moment, a lot of people are facing enormous inflation due to rises in electricity and gas, and I think it would help if they had a solution within weeks rather than a solution next April or later. That's not my speech, that is just a question.
If I'm correct, Councillor Cortell, I think HR are going to be looking at the working from home side of things. I don't think they'll be looking at a pay deal. Would I be correct with that?
Yes, the role of the HR committee in future years will be to consider that. On the basis the HR committee hasn't actually met once yet, and I'm not sure when the first meeting is planned for, but we can certainly look to get it on the agenda for the first meeting, whenever that is.
Did you want to say something else, Councillor Cortell?
Yes, I think I was looking for a date for the first meeting and how fast they can work with regards to these allowances.
I'm sorry, there isn't an answer to that question at the minute, Councillor Cortell. Anyone else? Councillor Coleman.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I certainly appreciate Councillor Giovanni and Councillor Dixon, and obviously the fact that this additional supplement has been arrived at. It's less than what the unions originally asked for at licensing, and it's less than what licensing asked for. But it's still, I think, better than the alternative option that licensing were presented at the time. So I think it's a considerable compromise. I don't necessarily agree with the not backdating till April. I think doing that now will be a sort of a reward to staff this year for a lot of the extra hard work that they've put in over the last few years. And then going forward from that, I sense, and I may be corrected on this, that staff pay awards happening in April works out better for people. I think that's when the sort of tax year is anew, and I think that sort of works better going forward. So I would maybe suggest to Councillor Gio reconsidering that part of his amendment. But apart from that, I think I just a brief speaking in terms of supporting the need to look at working from home allowances. Wealdon obviously have a working from home allowance, and I would hate to see it that staff look at what we're doing here, and they look at what they're doing in Wealdon, and they say, well, I can get the same as I do over here in Wealdon, but I also get a working from home allowance, so I'm just going to go and work for Wealdon, and then suddenly we have trouble recruiting staff. So I think it's important we do look at that, and I agree with Councillor Cortell that we need to be looking at that in a timely fashion, although I do understand the need to consider it properly under a committee to make sure that it is a fair scheme and a good scheme, and that it works for our staff. So I think I broadly support the amendment and the overall thrust of the motion, but I'd ask Councillor Gio to maybe reconsider the April to April. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coleman. Councillor Field.
Thank you, Chair. I think a working group or a committee, the terms of reference and the dates and the technical stuff is not something appropriate to be decided in full council. It needs to be done offline. But I do think that it's important to get this right rather than get it done fast. I hope everybody understands the need to do that. The thing that's always concerned me about pay rises is that I think but an awful lot of employers are unable to reward their employees to the level which they would like for all sorts of reasons. And this year has been incredibly difficult because things have happened like the fuel crisis and the cost of living crisis and the increase in interest rates, which have been completely outside our control, but have affected all of us, including our staff. And part of the knock-on effect of that is that we as a council do not have the funds to reward our staff, as I'm sure we would like to. But I can recall, having been on the licensing committee for some number of years, that we keep being promised a root and branch review of the pay scales. And as yet, that hasn't actually happened. So I'm putting in a plea to the new HR committee that they do that work alongside everything else. So when we're presented with this next year, we have a much easier discussion and a clearer discussion when we start talking about how to reward our staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Field. Councillor Hacking.
So thank you to everyone for the work that's gone on this, and I appreciate there's probably been quite a lot of discussions behind the scenes, given that it's quite sensitive. I just wanted to go back to the same sort of drum that I've been banging throughout this, in that I'd like a little bit more detail, if possible, on how we are going to fund this, because I'm just slightly concerned if it is being funded by redundancies, that there's a bit of a Russian roulette situation going on where some people will gain a pay rise, which they rightly deserve, and others might lose their jobs. So are you able just to clarify for me how we're going to afford this? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hacking. Councillor Earl-Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. I support the motion of Councillor J1 because it is something on the agenda that was worrying me. I do worry that too many of the staff are working from home. I have constituents who tell me it's very difficult indeed if they can't actually get down to the town hall to get a communication either by email or telephone. Telephones just don't get answered. Now, I don't know whether that's because there's just not enough staff or whether it is because staff are working from home. But personally, I'd like to see more staff return to the town hall and make it the hub that it once was. Because now, quite honestly, if you come into the town hall to see anybody other than in democratic services, it's like a ghost town, and it's not a nice atmosphere. I realise that there are difficulties to this, but I would really please ask that staff do return back to the town hall. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Earl-Williams. Councillor Gangley.
Thank you, Chairman. I think actually Councillor Hacking has asked for a large part of what I want to ask. But my question is, what is the cost of Councillor Gio1's proposal? how much over budget would it be, and how would that over budget part be financed? Would it require redundancies?
Mr Baden?
Thank you, Chair. The information's in the papers, and I don't think I need to repeat that. In terms of how it's going to be funded, that's difficult to say at the moment. We can't say that it will specifically be funded from redundancies, but it is pretty obvious that the Council is facing financial pressures at the moment, and the more we increase our costs over and above what we've budgeted, it has to be found somewhere. From where, it's too early to say. That would need to be worked up and agreed with members.
Thank you, Mr Baden. Councillor Maynard. Councillor Thomas.
Chair, members of the Council, I think the proposal by Councillor Girowan represents a considerable improvement upon the original proposals, and it's clear a great deal of thought has been put into the construction of this package. I'm sure, like everybody around this table, we would want this Council to be as generous as possible towards its staff, because we're all aware of the financial situation which there is in this country. I learnt today an interesting statistic, namely that the cost of basic foodstuffs is rising by 17%. So although we may talk about 10% inflation, the real inflationary figure paid by those people who are not prosperous is very much higher than that. And so even with this particular deal, we should be aware that we're offering people a pay cut. We should be aware of that. And I think that I personally feel a sense almost of guilt around that, because I'm in the position of asking people to make sacrifices. And those are sacrifices beyond the sacrifice that I know I will personally have to make. And I feel morally uncomfortable about doing that. There's a moral dimension to our decisions. And I think something we need to bear in mind is this. We think of the budget of this Council as something hard and firm and inflexible. But somehow we think of the budgets of our workers as being a little bit more like the shape of water. Something a bit more flexible, a bit more amorphous, subject to change. But what we need to realise is that our staff have to pay bills themselves. And those bills are just as hard, just as inflexible as the bills that we have to pay. So I would be in favour of this Council paying as much as it possibly can, and it does look as if this offer is exactly that. I would like to say something in favour of some of the proposals to go to the subcommittee. Namely, I think it would be a really good idea to offer the day, because that's a way of saying thank you to our staff for the efforts they've made during the pandemic, when they've gone over and above to serve the interests of this community, and it's a way of saying thank you. We really, really appreciate this. So far as homework working is concerned, there's obviously been a great difference in the balance here, because what is saved now on transport will be wiped out completely by the increase in fuel bills, and so people working from home will be disadvantaged. So I hope we are going to be able to move towards that. And so, just to say in conclusion, I think Councillor Girowan has done a splendid job in providing this package, and I hope that people working for the Council will be aware that we are constrained by a national situation. We'd like to pay you more, but there are national factors of which we all in this room are aware that have taken the economy of this country in a direction in which none of us wanted it to go. But nevertheless, within the constraints of that, this Council has done its very best for the people who work for us, and we very much appreciate their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Thomas. Councillor Kirby-Green.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the work you've done on this. And I entirely agree with all the points you've said about going to the HR committee. I think that's where it should be discussed. My only confusion is that when we were here last time, it was deferred. Because, and I know there was a lot of discussion in the LNGP meeting at which I attended about the fact we didn't have the funding for the higher amount, and that's why I voted against it. And I suppose I'm still struggling because it's been deferred. We're now back here with another offer, but we still don't know how it's going to be funded. So in my mind, we're no different to how we were. I mean, it's a smaller amount, I agree, but we still don't know how we're going to fund it. And I'm really concerned that, you know, Tony hasn't said, no, there won't be any redundancies, because he can't say there won't be any redundancies. And as Councillor Hacking said, you know, everyone sort of... I'm just very concerned because no one thinks they're going to be the one that's going to be made redundant. But they may well be if there are going to be redundancies. And I think the fact that we don't know how we're going to fund it is very concerning. So I'd like to have had a bit more detail that we haven't got.
Thank you, Councillor Kirby-Green. Councillor G1.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments around that. I think to address a number of points across the floor, I think the first one around the funding element, Councillor Kirby-Green, I completely agree. The position we were in last time was, well, how are we going to fund this? I think from the discussions that I've been having behind the scenes, I feel more assured that by not backdating, that allows us more scope to fund rather than trying to backdate, bearing in mind the last pay award was September 21. So we're looking at a 6-month pay review if we do backdate to April. So what I'm proposing is that we continue with an annual review so that the pay starts from September. But by doing that, it gives us better scope to be able to offer £1,500. If we didn't, the amount that we'd be offering people would be half that amount. So looking at it, it just feels more logical to not backdate. In terms of the funding, the bits that's kind of reassured me more is that the amount that this will cost is $362,000. That takes us $250,000 over budget. If we propose to not backdate, that reduces that down to around £125,000. And we know that there is contingency within the council's budget of around $200,000 that could be funded through, notwithstanding the increase in investments that we're starting to see with the rates moving and the changes to some of the car parking as well. So that's where my confidence comes from. And moving forward into the further years, it's something that we would build into the base budget each year as our starting and operating costs. So that would then be taken into consideration. So that's kind of where I got my confidence from in terms of being able to offer this higher amount. When we look at it in terms of inflation, we're never going to be able to reach inflation and meet the level that's rising at the moment, but that is fluctuating up and down. I think if you look at, for the majority of our staff working group, in terms of where the majority of our FTE sit, it represents around 6.8% as an increase. In the current climate, it doesn't feel enough. But when you compare that to previous 0.5% and 1% reviews, which are readily accepted, 6.5% for the majority of our teams, I think is a really strong proposition, considering there isn't really the funds to do it other than the kind of contingency elements that we're falling back on that I've said. In terms of the home working and time off, so just to cover that again, that said, I think there is definitely a case for it, but it's one that needs discussion around what the policy is and how do we reward that. So if there isn't a policy for the council at the moment, how can you pay an allowance for a policy that doesn't exist? So the policy needs to be in place first, and then to that policy, you can attach what conditions or how that looks like, whether it's a hybrid working allowance, a full allowance. In terms of Councillor Osborne's comments regarding tax, unfortunately, that's one thing you're never going to be able to avoid because it will be a taxable benefit. So even if you listed it as an allowance for our staff, they would be still taxed on it because it is classed as a benefit in kind. And equally, if you were to offer it in any other way, it would still be taxable. One of the only schemes that the council could potentially look at is whether they offered salary sacrifice. And salary sacrifice will mean that those expenses come out before your statutory salary of tax and national insurance is calculated. So with that approach, there may be the opportunity to inbuild some allowances. So people basically opt for certain things and then you give them the benefit that way. So there are ways that we could look at it, but on the whole, the tax bit would be challenging. So yeah, just in summary, just like to say thank you for everyone that's been involved in this. It's been a lot of discussion, a lot of backwards and forwards, because there is this dilemma about doing the very, very best we can for our staff versus the very little money that is there to play with. So hopefully you can all support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Deeron, and thank you very much for all the extra personal hours you're putting. I know you've put an awful lot into this to do the very best you can for our very valued staff. Did you still want to speak, Councillor Maynard?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And I only wanted to speak a little later in the debate because I wanted to hear exactly what Councillor Giron had to say in terms of some of those questions that have been asked and whether there were any supplementaries. And I think that's the reason now why I wish to speak now, is because we've heard what Tony Baden said in terms of the possible risk of redundancies. We've heard what Councillor Giron has said about contingencies and about a 200k contingencies. I mean, I think, to be quite frank, and this isn't in any way a political point, this is just trying to tease out the absolute facts behind what's in front of us this evening, both for the benefit of the staff and any public watching the meeting, and indeed the members to be able to understand, is does that contingency enable us to give a guarantee that there wouldn't be redundancies? Because I have to say, on this side of the chamber, in terms of the total amount now being proposed to be spent, that has been, amongst my colleagues on this side of the chamber, the main concern has been to make sure that, and if you compare the numbers here at Rother with neighbouring authorities, we already have, in terms of sheer numbers, a lean staff. Our concern is about the long-term resilience of this authority, and our concern is obviously to avoid redundancies. And it goes perhaps without saying, I think every single member in this chamber wants to pay tribute to the work that was done by our staff during COVID and for the work that our staff do day in and day out. And it's absolutely clear that staff have gone above and beyond during COVID. It's also absolutely clear, this has been referenced by other councils, that staff, especially those on the lower pay scales, and I welcome the comments that have been made by a number of councillors about the HR committee and about how they can revisit that in the future, because I certainly think that as we go through this winter, as we are unfortunately all adversely affected by rising living costs, whether they're the weekly shop or whether it's energy price increases, we would be naturally very concerned about those in this authority, working in this authority on the lowest pay scales. And I have to say, my other concern is around that increase in all scales, because I have to say, I think that we know that there are going to be significant pressures on those on the minimum wage or even those slightly above it, that they are the people that we would obviously most want to protect from any increases in living costs. So my specific question now is, can you give that assurance that there won't be redundancies? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Maynard. Sir Johnson.
In short, no, because I don't. My crystal ball doesn't work very well these days in terms of what the government settlement will be, and a lot will depend on that. What I can say is that my view is that if we don't treat our staff fairly and recognise in some way what's going on, I can't actually guarantee that we'll have staff here to actually provide the job that we're trying to do. And that's what we're trying to do. This is a balancing act between being realistic, not solving the problem. We can't solve the problem, but it is important that we do recognise that there is an issue and do something for our staff. That would be, but I can't give the guarantee that Councillor Maynard asked for.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. I think we're about ready to take the vote on the amendment. Oh, we've got Councillor Bayliss.
Councillor Cottell.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Courtell.
No, he can't speak. He's spoken once. No, he can't.
Spoken.
Yes, I've...
Councillor Courtell, I do apologise. You've spoken once, so you won't be able to speak again.
Sorry, I said that was just a question. That wasn't my speech.
Go ahead, Councillor Courtell.
Thank you, Chair. Most appreciated. I fully endorse what the Chief Executive has just said. I think we have to think very carefully about our moral obligation towards those who work for us. And there is the risk of staff voting with their feet and going to other councils. We need to maintain staff morale and goodwill, and we need to ensure that as few staff as possible experience hardship. I've done a little bit of number crunching, and my figures are slightly different from what Councillor Giron's come up with. According to the calculation that I've done based on the information from HR, 79 full-time employees on pay scales S3 and S4 with salaries of between 20,300 and 22,500 will have a 7% pay rise. A further 37 employees on pay scale S5 between salaries of 23,900 and 26,200 will have a 6% pay rise. A further 28 employees...
Councillor Cortell, could I just please ask the point to...
The point is that there is a taper which goes down at 765 down to 1% rise for the chief executive, and I think that that is fair and right, and I appreciate that all staff will get a pay cut. It's been slanted to help those on lower pay, and that I support. I understand that Unison and staff side have accepted an offer which now Councillor Giawan is trying to cut to 6 months instead of a year, and I wonder how that rests with the position of staff side.
Thank you, Councillor Cortell. Did someone else have their hand up? Councillor Barnes.
Apologies. We seem to have got ourselves into a position where we deferred to find more out, and we haven't found more out. We have no more idea tonight how we are going to fund this increase than we had a month ago. What we do have is a sensible amendment from Councillor Giawan, which I think is probably the right way forward at this moment, because it is a flat rate increase. It is one that we clearly will struggle to afford, because within that 200,000 inflation increase, we've got to meet increased energy bills and a number of other inflationary increases. I frankly think we will still be lucky at the end of the year to end up with the budgeted 2.6 million from reserves that we are currently projecting. But nevertheless, it is, I think, the only practical thing. I regret it, because I hate it when we have to depart from national pay offers, and we've got badly out of line, I think, with the national pay scales. I think we do need to budget more realistically about pay. I think we need to avoid redundancies. And I think we need to sort out the tax position on these allowances. Because as I know, as somebody who did work part-time from home, I had to consider quite carefully the tax position on offices. So it's quite right that that part of the motion goes to the HR committee to take a really hard look at a practical scheme which will benefit our staff. But I have to say I am very unhappy that we're getting so much out of line with national pay scales. And I think, frankly, I will reluctantly support that amendment. I would have liked, actually, to have done slightly better for some of the lower paid than we're actually going to be able to do. I do counsel, however, Chairman, you can never match inflation in an inflationary crisis. If you do, you simply drive up wages, that drives up prices, drives up taxes, you then drive up wages, and you end up, as we did in the 70s, in a wage price spiral. And we can't get into that game. It doesn't benefit anybody.
Thank you, Councillor Barnes. Councillor Bayliss, sorry, you were before Councillor Barnes, I didn't see you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, it's nice to follow Councillor Barnes. You know, I have to say, if your government had handled the economy slightly more differently, we wouldn't be in such a deep crisis as we currently are. And you know full well that. You know full well that.
Can we settle down, please, and keep it to the topic in hand?
Right, okay. Well, as I say, I'm just following on from Councillor Barnes's comments, Chair. What I would say is that I reluctantly am going to support this. I look at this and look at the original motion, which was proposed by the Vice Chair, and would have wanted to have supported that. I reluctantly support the amendment. I would say, as the the Cabinet Member for Economic Development and Regeneration, that I speak to a lot of businesses who are currently finding there's great pressure in recruiting staff. It really is a buyer's market at the moment. And when people ring me up and say, I've been on the phone for half an hour trying to get onto customer services and they can't reach anyone on customer services, and you find out that it's that part of the issue is around staff shortages. I think we really have to look at what we are offering our staff. We're in a buyer's market. Another point I would like to make is if you look at probably our main competitor in Bexhill, which is Hastings Direct, they have recently announced a scheme to help their staff with a cost of living. They've put a sizable amount of money to one side to help their staff with that, and they have other allowances. So these are the companies. This is the area we are currently working within. And I would ask that the HR committee takes that all into account when it looks at these allowances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Bayliss. I've just got one more person, Councillor Clark, to speak, then I will just take it to the vote.
Thank you, Sharon. I will be brief. I listened with intent, so I was, like Councillor Maynard, it's best to let them speak first and then summarise. But I also really concerned that we don't have to go down the road of redundancies. But what wasn't said was, well, OK, then if we give the staff a lower increase, we won't have redundancies. Well, I'm not going to support a lower increase. It's a reasonable increase that we can give, and we will try and sort out and avoid redundancies by finding a funding. But we can't. There was no proposal for a lower offer to staff to avoid the redundancies because we don't want that. And the final point I would say, we've got the winter months coming. When you look at people working from home, instead of walking out the door, turning off the light and turning the heating off and coming to work, they're having to use their heating and their lighting to work from home. So they're going to incur costs between now and end of February and March. So, yeah, that really needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Clark. I will now take the vote on the amendment. All those in favour? It is Councillor Williams, it's the amendment. Thank you. All those against? Any abstentions? Thank you. There is now a motion on the floor which has been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? No? So we take the vote again. Please, all those in favour?
The motion as amended, isn't it?
It's a motion as amended. All those in favour? Yeah. Okay. It's the same as you've just voted on, just for clarity. All those against? Abstentions? There are 3. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and our lovely staff. The meeting is now closed at 7:10.